Hello and welcome to my video where I will show you how I made a cloak, or a cape if you like, from 1 metre of fabric. How this tutorial came about was that I bought a metre of red crushed velvet with the purpose of making a cloak, but then when I came to actually look at tutorials on the internet, they all used way more than a metre of fabric to make. So I was kind of stuck, but then I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I'll try and make a cloak from just 1 metre and see how it goes. I recorded the steps of making it as I went along, and I liked the finished product. So I thought I would share how I did it with you just in case you would find it useful. What you will need to make this cloak include the fabric. Now I used some red crushed velvet, which has a bit of stretch to it. I would say if you're a sewing beginner, then stick with something that doesn't have stretch, and preferably something that doesn't fray as well. For instance, fleece is a really good choice. I wouldn't recommend crushed velvet for beginners because it has a bit of stretch and also it sheds little fibres, so it isn't the easiest to work with. If you do want to use a knit or stretchy fabric, just be aware that it is a little bit more difficult than something that does not stretch. The 1 metre of fabric that I bought was 150 centimetres wide. You'll also need a sewing machine and all the usual sewing equipment. So for instance, an iron and ironing board, a seam ripper, a ruler, some fabric scissors, and or rotary cutter and cutting mat. If you are sewing with a stretchy or knit fabric, you'll also need the appropriate needles. You'll also need some sewing pins. A long ruler will be really handy, 1 metre or longer, or anything long and straight that you can draw against because you'll be working with long lines in this project. Also, you'll need a fabric pen or a piece of chalk or some other way of marking your fabric temporarily, so something that will wash out or just come off over time. If you don't have a fabric pen or chalk or anything to mark the fabric with, then instead you can use pieces of paper sellotaped together in order to make a template of the cloak first. And that will get around the need for a fabric pen to mark directly onto the fabric. If you're planning to make more than 1 cloak, then making a paper template is a good idea because it can be reused. You'll also need any other sewing accessories you usually use, for instance a magnetic seam guide or a sewing gauge. And lastly, to go around the neck of the cloak, you'll need some kind of ribbon or cord, or maybe a toggle and clasp if that's your preferred fastening. I just used some cheap red ribbon for mine. Okay, so let's get started. As usual with sewing projects, the majority of the work is in the preparation. So to start with, you need to wash and preferably iron your fabric. If you're working with 1 yard rather than 1 metre of fabric, then you'll have to rejig the measurements I give at the beginning of this video. However, the general shapes and the instructions will all still apply. Try and get the widest piece of fabric you can, which I believe is about 60 inches wide. If you're using the same size of fabric that I'm using, i.e. 100 centimetres by 150 centimetres, then make sure that you place your fabric so it's 150 centimetres across and 100 centimetres high, so it's wider than it is tall. As you can see on this diagram, I've put all the measurements and also some colourful little circles. This is just a guide, you don't need to be absolutely exact, but you just want these same shapes. So as long as you start with a rectangle, you'll probably be able to work out the shapes well enough. Okay, so now I'm going to go through how I went about marking all of the points and the lines on this template. And I'm going to transfer those points and lines onto my fabric. Be sure to do this step with the wrong or reverse side of the fabric facing upwards. Okay, so the first points that I mark are in blue. So if you look at the blue circles, those represent halfway across the piece of fabric. So in my case, that's 75 centimetres from either side. So where those blue circles are, I take my fabric pen and mark a point on my fabric. To make this quicker, you can just fold the fabric in half widthways to find the central line. Once you've marked the blue points, we're going to mark the pink points. Now these points are going to be marked at the top edge of the fabric, 16 centimeters in from each side. If you're used to sewing and cutting out templates, then you'll notice that this is a symmetrical pattern and therefore can be cut out after you've folded the fabric in half widthways. Doing it that way means that you only have to mark half the points and cut half the lines, essentially, which will save you time. However, I did it by marking each point and cutting each line individually. So once you've marked the pink points, you move on to the yellow. Now the yellow points are 54 centimeters apart, and so measuring from the central blue point on the bottom edge, they are 27 centimeters either side. You're now going to draw a line between the pink points and the yellow points. So you're going to draw one long line on each side. This is where the long ruler or long piece of wood or anything you've got lying around that's just long and straight really comes in handy. If you're struggling to mark that long straight line, then simply fold the fabric at the pink points and the yellow points, so that you have a fold along that line that you need to draw. You can then iron the fold, and this will form the line that you need to mark. The next points to mark are in green. You simply measure from the top edge along the lines that you just marked for 6 centimeters. And then you mark your points, one on each of the lines. You then draw a line between the blue center point on the top edge and each of the green points. The last points to mark are in orange, and to measure those you simply measure 100 centimeters from each of the pink points. So measure from the top edge from each pink point along the lines that you drew previously for 100 centimeters and mark the points. You then join these orange points to the bottom left and bottom right corners of the fabric. And now you've marked out all the pieces of the cloak. So the next step is to simply cut them out. You can do this with fabric scissors, or you can use a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. If you are using a rotary cutter, be sure to use it along a metal ruler in order to get an accurate straight line. If you're using a paper template, then pin the template to your fabric, making sure that the fabric is completely flat before cutting out the pieces with a rotary cutter and cutting mat. Please note that you don't cut along the central line that I've drawn as a dashed line, you only cut along the solid black lines. So all in all, you will be making 3 cuts on either side, so 6 in total. When you've finished, you should have 3 pieces that look like this. Before you get stuck into the project, I would recommend watching the video all of the way through, just so you get an idea of how it's done, and there might be parts of the cape or the instructions that you might want to customise or change, depending on what you want the cloak to look like. To move on to the next step, I'm now going to turn all of the pieces so that they are right side up. I'm then going to put the large central section upside down so the shorter edge is at the top, and I'm going to swap round the outer 2 pieces. And that will give you an arrangement just like this. On the diagrams, the wrong side is represented by a pale red, and the right side, or the front of the fabric, is represented by a darker red. We are now on to the first sewing stage, and we want to join these 3 pieces of fabric together along those seam lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one side, in this case the left side, and flip it over onto the central section so that it's the same orientation, but the wrong side of the fabric is now facing upwards. You want to line it up so that the bottom left corner of the side section matches up with the bottom left corner of the central section. And then make sure that the edges line up as perfectly as you can get them. Don't worry if the edges are not exactly the same length, and they're a bit mismatched at the top, just make sure that the bottom left corners are matched. You then need to pin these two pieces of fabric together with sewing pins, making sure that the fabric lies nice and flat and isn't stretched out or wrinkled. And then it's time to take this fabric over to your sewing machine and sew a seam line. You want to sew this line 1/2 inch from the edge, i.e. the seam allowance is 1/2 inch. And because I'm using a knit fabric, I used ballpoint needles, which are specifically designed for using with knit fabric, and I also used a zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch I used was 2.0 long and 1.5 wide, but you can use whichever specification suits you best. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam line to secure the thread in place. If you're using a non-stretch fabric, like a woven cotton, then you can do this seam line with a straight stitch instead. Once you've sewn that seam, do exactly the same with the other side, and this will result in all 3 pieces of fabric being joined together. You now have the main basis of your cloak. If, after you've done this, the top side is a bit mismatched, it's possible that the central section is a bit taller than the side sections, then you can just even this out by cutting straight along the top of that central section. So you basically just cut off the excess fabric. We're now going to turn the cloak inside out like so, and bring the raw vertical edges together so that they meet down the centre, as shown in this diagram. You want to make sure that the fabric lies as flat as you can make it, especially around the top edge, and you want the top edges of all the pieces to line up perfectly at the top. You then need to take a tape measure and measure around your neck, or the neck of the person you're making the cloak for. You then half this number, and that is going to be the section at the top edge that you're going to leave open. So half that number again, so you basically have 1/4 of the neck circumference measurement, and then mark that distance either side of the central opening. I've shown these as blue points. If you're using a drawstring fastening, you can add a little bit more if you like, depending on how loose you want the neckline to be. Once you've marked those 2 points, you need to mark another 2 points, this time 1 on each side of the cloak. So you measure from the top edge along the folded edge for about 5 centimeters and make a mark. And you do this the same on the other side. You're then going to draw a line with your fabric pen and ruler between these 2 marks on each side. Now for some reason when I was making this, I just sewed straight along these lines and I ended up getting really pointy shoulders. So the next stage that you should do is just to curve off the edges of these lines. So you go from about where the seam is and draw a line that curves nice and smoothly downwards, like so. And you want to finish the curved line about 5 centimeters below where the end of the straight line is, as shown here. You're then going to pin the cloak together along this line, making sure that there are no wrinkles and you get the cloak to lie as flat as possible along the line that you've pinned. And you do this on both sides. Just before you go to sew these lines, you can always turn the cloak inside out very carefully and try on the cloak just to make sure it's the right kind of shape that you're after. Just be careful you don't stab yourself with the pins. And then you take the fabric over to your sewing machine and sew along those lines that you've drawn. Again, I used a zigzag stitch, same as I did for the seams. If you're using a non-stretch fabric, you'll be using the straight stitch again. Always make sure that you don't sew over the pins, but you take the pins out just as you're coming up to them on the sewing machine. And then you'll end up with something that looks like this. You then take your fabric scissors or some pinking shears if you've got them, and cut off the excess fabric to leave about 1/2 inch next to the sewn line. If you need to adjust the fit at any point, feel free to do so. When you've done that, turn the cloak so that the reverse side of the fabric is facing upwards again, and the cloak is nicely laid out, all flat and smooth. The next step is to hem all the way around the outside of the cloak. Now I'm using a knit fabric that doesn't fray, so really I didn't have to hem this fabric. However, I prefer the hemmed look a bit more than the natural look, because naturally the velvet would curl a bit at the edges. So it's completely up to you. If you're using a non-fraying fabric, you can choose to hem or not, depending on the look you want. You need to fold over the fabric edge by 1/2 inch all the way around and pin in place. If you press the hem in place using an iron, that makes it a lot easier, and it's especially important to do if you're using a woven fabric. You then sew as neatly as you can all the way around to secure the hem. I decided to use a zigzag stitch 1.6 long and 1.5 wide. Because the cloak's so big, this can take some time, but try and be neat because this stitch will be visible from the outside. Once you've finished the hem, your cloak should look something like this. If you're struggling to hem around the collar section, don't worry, just do your best. As you can see, we can't get an even 1/2 inch hem all the way around the collar because of how we've sewn the shoulders, and there's an angle there that makes it a bit difficult. If you plan to add a toggle, button or clasp fastening to this cloak, then now is the time to do it. So turn the cloak the right side out and simply sew your fastening of choice onto the top of the cloak. And there you go, you've finished your cloak. However, if you'd prefer to have a drawstring neckline, then I'm going to show you how to add that right now. You'll need to basically form a tube around the neck of the cloak. To do this, you just need to fold over the top edge of the cloak and sew it in place. Because we've added the shoulder sections in order to make a nicer fit, this does make it a little bit more complicated to add a drawstring to the top. However, I'll walk you through this step by step. So the first thing you do, with the cloak still upside down, you fold over the central section of the neckline, just ignoring the side sections for now. You want to fold this piece of fabric over just enough so that the cord or ribbon that you're going to use will be able to slide easily inside that tube. So you need to fold this section of fabric over by the diameter of your ribbon or cord, plus 1/4 inch for the seam allowance, plus about 1/4 or 1/2 inch just to give it a bit of give so that the ribbon or cord does not get stuck. So let's say your ribbon is 1/2 inch wide, then you would fold the fabric over by 1/2 inch plus 1/4 inch plus 1/4 inch. So you would fold the fabric over by 1 inch in total. So you then pin the fabric in place. You then take the fabric over to the sewing machine and sew about 1/4 inch from the hem edge. You want to sew neatly because this line of stitches will be visible from the outside, and you again want to use a zigzag stitch if you're using a stretch fabric. Make sure you backstitch at the beginning and end as usual. You now have a channel that your ribbon or cord can go through. We're now going to add a channel or cord to the side sections of fabric. Now we can't just fold the fabric over in the same manner on the side sections because where we've sewn the shoulders, it just doesn't fold over that way. So in order to proceed, we need to unpick some of the stitches we did previously to sew those shoulder lines. So you need to get your seam ripper and just unpick enough of that shoulder line on each side so that you can then fold the fabric over at the top of the side sections by 1 inch or however wide you need to have the channel. Once you've done that, it should look a bit like this. You then pin that folded over section in place just like you did for the central section and sew along it 1/4 inch from that hem edge. If you're using a fraying fabric, you'll also need to tidy up the raw edges that we now have in between the channels. So any raw edges, you just need to add a narrow hem or just zigzag or overlock stitch over the fabric edges. You'll also just need to do a reinforcement stitch over the end of the shoulder seam, because we just unpicked part of that seam and the thread isn't fully secure. So we just need to do a short little line over the end of that seam. Once you've done that on the other side as well, you have 3 channels, one at the top of each of the fabric pieces. Now all you need to do is thread the ribbon or cord through those channels. To do that, the easiest way is to attach the end of your ribbon or cord to a safety pin. You then simply pass that safety pin through the channel and manipulate it through the fabric with your hands. You feed the ribbon or cord through all 3 channels and you've now finished your cloak. If you want to fix the ribbon or cord in place, then you can just do a short line of stitches through 2 fabric layers and through the ribbon or cord, just in the middle of the central channel. That will just make sure that the ribbon or cord does not come out of the channels. And there you go, it's all finished. If you don't mind not having the shoulder shaping, you can make the drawstring collar a lot easier to do by going back to the step just before you hem all around the edge of the cloak. At that point, you can cut straight across the top of the cloak, as shown here, just to make it a completely flat line at the top. This makes it so much easier to do the drawstring, because once you've done that and then you hem all around the cape, you can simply turn down the top edge like so and sew it down all the way along like shown in this diagram to make the tube shape. Then you just feed the ribbon or cord through that channel. So deciding not to do the shoulder shaping does make the drawstring stage a lot easier, because you can make the channel all in one go rather than having to unpick any seams and then make the channel in 3 different sections like I did. And obviously if you choose to do a toggle clasp or something similar, then that removes the need to do a drawstring at all and therefore makes it even simpler. So the idea of this tutorial really is to give you the measurements you need and the shapes you need to build a basic cloak shape, and you can add to it, change it, amend it however you like, depending on what result you want. That leaves it open to opportunity, so you can stick all sorts of things on here. You can sew stars all over the cape, you can make it wider, longer, make it from different fabrics. It's all up to you really, depending on what kind of look you're after. I really hope this video has been helpful and has inspired you to give this project a go yourself. Thank you very much for watching.